Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Morris "Mo" Dalitz, the businessman who helped shape Las Vegas into the glittering empire we know today. Known for his intelligence, charm, and vision, Dalitz transformed opportunity into influence, turning desert dust into luxury and lights. To some, he was a visionary entrepreneur who brought prosperity to a growing city. To others, a man whose success blurred the line between business and power. Before we begin, like this video. We're aiming for 100 likes in this video. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to bring you even more fascinating stories from the underworld. Now, settle in and let the story of Morris Dalitz guide you into the night. He was born Morris Barney Dalitz on the 24th of December 1899, a winter baby of immigrant parents in Boston. The family didn't stay put. They chased opportunity westward, settling in Michigan. His father ran laundry and dry cleaning shops, the kind that required dawn starts and long evenings under hot lamps. As a teenager, Mo learned the trade: pickup routes, ledgers, maintenance, the art of keeping customers loyal. School gave him basics. But the shop taught him profit and loss, the language of suppliers, and an early sense that a good front door brings trust, and a back door can move anything from towels to something a little more interesting. During the First World War, Moish to his elders and Mo to his friends wore a uniform and did his bit. Then came home to the hum of machinery and the steady work of the family trade. Michigan in the 1920 seconds was a place of industry and hustle. Detroit turned out cars by the trainload. Across the river lay Canada, and in between the United States had decided that alcohol was against the law. Prohibition hit like a starter's pistol. New fortunes appeared in whispers, and every town had someone who knew someone with a boat or a truck. The press later tied Mo to Detroit's underworld crowd and to bootlegging rings that threaded liquor across the water and down the highways. He rarely bragged and kept a compact profile, but law enforcement files and later congressional hearings linked him to the illicit liquor economy that flourished in those years. The laundry trucks, legitimate on their face, offered a kind of camouflage many bootleggers loved. Routes and schedules looked plain to the untrained eye. Whether the cargo was linens or Canadian whiskey, the drivers learned to keep both hands on the wheel and their mouths shut. Detroit's scene was rougher than it looked. Rival crews feuded. Extortion rackets tried to shake down legitimate businesses, and the line between a businessman and a lawbreaker could blur before breakfast. Mo built a reputation as the quiet, organized one. He cultivated relationships beyond Michigan, especially with men in Cleveland who had their own networks and ambitions. The Cleveland crowd names like Morris Kleinman, Sam Tucker, and Louis Rothkopf stayed in touch with him through the Prohibition years. Together they created supply chains that ran like railways, distillers and importers on one end, speakeasies and private clubs on the other, and drivers who knew the back roads in between. Money moved, bottles moved, and reputations hardened. It wasn't work that came with public credit lines or press releases, but it demanded discipline and logistics, and that's where Mo excelled. By the early 1930 seconds, the dry experiment collapsed. Repeal didn't end hustling. It just changed the menu. The same skills: keeping cops happy, keeping books straight, managing rooms where people wanted to spend money, translated neatly to gaming. Cleveland had its share of backroom wagering, and nearby northern Kentucky blossomed into a hotbed of flashy night spots. Cincinnati's suburbs across the river hosted roadhouses with stage shows, fine dining, and card rooms behind velvet ropes. The Beverly Hills Country Club in Southgate, the Lookout House in Covington, elegant addresses with a lot going on behind the music. Reports from the era place Mo and his Cleveland partners at the center of that circuit. They financed and operated gambling rooms, ran count rooms with exacting control, and built reputations for smooth operations where customers could dress up, order a steak, and play. It was against the law in those counties, but sheriffs, city officials, and state politicians often looked away. The cost of that silence appeared as steady envelopes, and favors a form of bribery common to vice districts of the era. Raids happened occasionally. Chips disappeared into safes. Lawyers posted bond, and the doors reopened. Arrest records show nuisance charges, occasional indictments, and a carousel of watchdogs. Convictions were rare for the top brass. That was the pattern. Heat, then cool. He understood the risks. A gambling hall could be shuttered by a new prosecutor, or a scandal could churn the headlines and bring a governor's task force. The Cleveland group adapted. They diversified stakes across several venues and used multiple layers of management so that when a raid took down tables at one club, another location kept the cash flowing. It wasn't glamorous from the inside: clipboards, shift schedules, cashiers trained to keep accurate counts, and tight lips. But the revenue dwarfed many legitimate businesses. And with it came influence. Politicians and police chiefs took meetings. Bankers watched carefully but did business when collateral was sound. For a man like Mo, who valued order, the enterprise required timing more than swagger. Not every door he opened led to a roulette wheel. He and his circle kept legitimate ventures alive, too. Dry cleaning remained a steady anchor. Trucks still ran routes. Ownership of buildings and service companies made sense. If a newspaper sniffed around the gambling halls, the tax returns for legal businesses provided respectable cover. The balance also softened public opinion. It's easier to be tolerated when you employ local residents, pay suppliers, and donate to community drives. Even then, scrutiny didn't stop. National magazines wrote about the Northern Kentucky clubs, including the way organized crime groups used the region as an alternative to Chicago's tighter enforcement. The old prohibition skill operating one step ahead of the badge remained essential. Washington paid attention to vice and income figures during the Depression and the New Deal. Later, the post-war country tuned in more closely to organized crime. Mo's name appeared in intelligence summaries, and then in the bright public glare of televised hearings. Some of his colleagues went to prison. Others faded away. He preferred to frame himself as a businessman whose line of work had moved with the times, steering clear of violence and hiring good accountants. When asked about the past, he stayed calm, careful, exact. He used the language of licenses, not muscle. He also understood that public legitimacy could be earned in places where gambling was legal. One place stood out. Nevada had legalized casino gambling decades earlier, and after the war, Las Vegas began its transformation from dusty town to resort corridor. Entrepreneurs built glamour onto a desert highway. Big rooms, stage acts, golf courses, and floor shows. A Los Angeles promoter named Wilbur Clark broke ground on an ambitious property called the Desert Inn, then struggled to finish. That's where the Cleveland money met Nevada ambition. Mo and his partners stepped in with financing that saved the project, brought discipline to construction and operations, and positioned the property for an opening that would put it on the national map. The move was a pivot from speakeasies and shutter-prone clubs to a regulated gaming market with a state board, visible audits, and a chance at mainstream respect. It was a calculated bet. Running a Las Vegas resort demanded broader skills than collecting markers in a back room. You had to manage entertainment contracts, hotel staffing, restaurant suppliers, golf course maintenance, and junket hosts. You had to cultivate bankers in New York, union leaders in the Midwest, and travel editors in California. You also had to convince Nevada regulators that your money was clean enough for a license. That last part proved the most delicate. Investigators didn't forget Kentucky and the Prohibition period. They studied ownership structures, the relationship between corporate officers and old syndicate associates, and the flow of cash from the count room to the bank. Mo understood this landscape. He installed trusted lieutenants, built transparent paper trails where possible, and tried to keep controversial figures out of public-facing roles. The transition from illicit clubs to legal casinos didn't erase the past. Federal agents and Senate committees explored how pension funds and private lenders financed new properties. Journalists dug for names behind names. In that environment, Mo maintained a dual image. On one side, hotel developer, golf impresario, civic booster, a man who gave generously to hospitals and local causes. On the other, a strategist from the bootlegging era, a central figure in illegal gambling circuits, and a fixer whose reach extended into city halls and union halls. Neither image was entirely wrong. Together, they formed the composite that defined him. He kept his circle tight. Partners he'd known since the 1,920 seconds remained close. new. Allies, lawyers, architects, accountants joined the roster as the projects expanded. Those who worked with him described a demanding but steady boss with a preference for results over theatrics. He pushed for professional management and insisted that his properties deliver more than table games. He knew that chefs, showroom acts, and fair dealing with guests built long-term loyalty. He also knew that room tax receipts and payrolls could impress local officials at least as much as a round of golf. The desert had once been a place to hide. Under his gaze, it became a place to grow. Yet the ledger of his life kept a column for law. His criminal record didn't feature violent offenses, but it included the conduct of entire enterprises that were illegal in the places he first ran them. Bootlegging during Prohibition, the operation of gambling rooms in jurisdictions where such activity was unlawful, and the associated bribery to protect those operations, that trio defined the core of his early career troubles. He faced raids, interrogations, and periodic indictments that rarely led to lasting convictions. Later, investigative bodies probed his finances, questioned his tax filings, and scrutinized the sources of his investment capital. He fought those battles with lawyers and, when necessary, with settlements and restructuring that satisfied agencies enough to keep licenses intact. Each move was a negotiation between ambition and scrutiny. As Las Vegas beckoned, he carried with him a playbook written in ledger lines and handshakes. He understood that steady leadership could turn a desert resort into a showcase, and that philanthropy could knit a man to a city as effectively as a stock certificate. He also knew that every ribbon cutting invited a camera, and every camera drew a reporter who might ask where the first dollars came from. The man who once let the rum runners do the talking now stepped into the public eye, choosing his words with care and measuring each answer against the story he wanted told not only about himself, but about the place he was helping build. The desert air had a way of making choices feel permanent. The move west wasn't a whim. He saw a place where a person could put money on the table, build a big room for music and bright games, and do it under state rules rather than in the shadows of a river town. Nevada offered a clean slate on paper, if not in memory. He arrived with partners who knew him from the long nights back in the Midwest. They weren't showmen. They were organizers and financiers, with a reputation for keeping operations neat and proceeds accounted for, at least inside their own walls. A Los Angeles promoter had broken ground on a dream resort that outgrew its bankroll. Costs rose, timetables slipped, suppliers got nervous, and a half-finished shell stood on the strip waiting for rescue. He and the Cleveland Circle stepped in with cash, contracts, and a fresh plan. They kept the founder on as a public face, the smiling host greeting celebrities, while they installed bookkeepers, pit bosses, and engineers who could turn a pretty sketch into a profitable enterprise. That hotel became the Desert Inn, a property that would carry his imprint for decades. Opening nights in Las Vegas could feel like movie premieres. The Desert Inn rolled out a showroom with polished brass and velvet seats, a casino floor with dice tables under bright domes, and a lobby built to make every guest feel like someone had been expecting them for years. He favored elegance over noise. He pushed a golf course into the plan, a green oasis across from cactus and sand, because he knew daylight recreation kept rooms full, drew families and conventioneers, and gave a resort stature beyond its tables. The count room followed a rigid routine. Dealers rotated on schedules, hosts tracked high rollers with cards and memory, and a hierarchy kept the work predictable. The goal was to make risk look like leisure and revenue feel like hospitality. The national spotlight found him almost immediately. A Tennessee senator led hearings that toured the country, asking how illicit money flowed through American cities and into legal ventures. His name sat on witness lists, alongside men known for much harder edges. He appeared in a suit and tie, answered questions in measured tones, and described himself as a businessman who'd moved from a period of restricted liquor to licensed entertainment in a state that allowed it. Senators pressed him on his past associates and the source of construction funds. He didn't raise his voice or get rattled. He acknowledged old work tied to prohibition and to gaming in places that didn't sanction it, and he insisted that he ran orderly rooms and followed the law where he operated. Those sessions didn't end with handcuffs, but they fixed his name in the public mind, developer and benefactor to some, fixture of the underworld to others. To understand the contrast, you have to step back to the Ohio River Valley before the desert became his focus. In northern Kentucky, glamorous night spots flourished in counties that had weak enforcement but strong appetites for floor shows and wagering. The Beverly Hills Country Club at Southgate and the Lookout House at Covington drew crowds in tuxedos and gowns, with orchestras, headliners, and private rooms where chips moved quickly. Authorities later documented how operators in that circuit, including his longtime partners, kept card rooms open through regular payoffs to local officials. Grand juries and state task forces occasionally forced closures, seized equipment, or indicted managers. He was associated with that world by both press accounts and law enforcement reports. And while minor arrests came and went, he avoided the kind of conviction that removed owners from the field. It was a steady pattern: a raid, adverse headlines, a lawyer on retainer, and a reopening with a fresh layer of staff. Bribery to protect illegal gambling was part of that era's routine. Envelopes passed between club representatives and officials to ensure a friendly posture, a practice described in later testimony by multiple figures from the region. He operated within that practice as a financier and organizer, making certain the books balanced and the entertainment stayed first class. The charge was vice, not force. The record doesn't tie him to bloodshed. His influence came from money, logistics, and relationships, not from street power. When the heat rose after new governors promised cleanups or journalists campaigned for reforms, he adjusted, shifted resources, or closed a room rather than provoke a fight he couldn't win. The move to Nevada promised a different bargain. Las Vegas casinos paid taxes, held state licenses, and submitted to audits. That didn't mean regulators forgot a man's past. In the early years, licensing bodies questioned whether someone with his history should hold a personal gaming license. Solutions were pragmatic. He took titles that leaned toward development or consulting, installed trusted executives in day-to-day roles that required direct licensure, and kept daily operations within standards that inspectors could verify. Corporate structures spread ownership across partnerships and subsidiaries. Those layers were common in the industry and in other businesses, but in his case, they carried a special meaning. They demonstrated that he could function inside rules. Even while the memory of his earlier life shaped public opinion, financing remained a sensitive subject. Conventional banks were tentative about lending large sums to casinos. That gap created space for loans from union pension funds, particularly from the Central States Fund tied to the Teamsters. Across the Strip and downtown, builders obtained millions through those channels, at interest rates that made sense for both sides. He and his group moved in that world. Government committees later examined how such loans were approved, which intermediaries vouched for borrowers, and whether lenders did enough diligence on ownership histories. His properties, like others, faced questions about those arrangements. He handled that attention with paperwork and seasoned attorneys, arguing that the money came through lawful instruments, the collateral was solid, and the projects created jobs and tax revenue. Investigators kept files and asked tough questions, but the projects continued. The Desert Inn became more than a casino with rooms. He pushed for a professional golf event that brought champions to Las Vegas in the early 1950 seconds. A travel story about a golf tournament and a desert resort sells a different image than a crime hearing. That was the point. He recruited big-name performers to the showroom, learned to juggle entertainers' needs with the budgets that kept the ledger healthy, and insisted the food and service match the price tag. Employees described him as demanding, private, and consistent. He wanted standards met without theatrics. The brand he built relied on repeat business and word of mouth, not just curiosity seekers chasing a fad. He didn't leave the Midwest behind entirely. He maintained friendships with people who had shared earlier ventures. They visited the desert, invested in new projects, or quietly enjoyed the resorts as valued guests. Reporters noted those visits and drew lines from past to present. Some of his peers from Cleveland and Kentucky faced prosecutions or were shut out of Nevada roles, either by boards that denied applications or by business realities that favored quieter partners. He pursued a middle path. He accepted that scrutiny would never vanish, and he chose to show regulators and civic leaders a ledger filled with payroll, construction contracts, and charitable donations. The charity work wasn't a coat of paint. It was a significant part of his civic identity. He gave to hospitals, supported temples and community centers, and helped fund initiatives that made Las Vegas feel less like a boomtown and more like a hometown. Sunrise Hospital rose on Maryland Parkway, with backing from his circle, bringing modern medical care to a city that had been relying on small facilities. He backed scholarships and community drives, Those efforts earned plaques, dinners, and friendly columns. Critics called it reputation laundering. Supporters called it leadership. He saw it as both duty and good business. Because a city that thrives sustains the resorts that helped build it. His earlier legal troubles continued to echo. Federal agencies reviewed his taxes more than once, as they did with many figures from that world. Disputes over assessments and deductions led to negotiations and, at times, settlements. Public records show that authorities probed the source of funds used in construction, the handling of cash receipts, and the relationships between casino executives and outside suppliers. He navigated those issues without a career-ending judgment. The absence of a dramatic conviction didn't erase the past. It simply meant that the contest was fought in hearing rooms and offices, instead of courtrooms with juries. Downtown, the gaming scene expanded with new towers and bright signs. He and his colleagues took interests in additional properties, sometimes as investors, sometimes as advisors. The city matured. Showrooms hosted global stars. Conventions filled ballrooms. The Strip's skyline reflected a rising confidence. In private, he continued to manage risk like a quiet engineer. Diversify revenue, keep multiple projects moving, deal with regulators respectfully, avoid feuds he couldn't win, and remember that publicity cuts both ways. He was careful with the press, willing to cooperate with friendly outlets and less talkative when a microphone belonged to a reporter who treated him like a permanent defendant. He knew that legal gaming attracted scammers along with tourists. The state created new bodies, first a control board, later a commission to sharpen oversight. Those agencies audited games, vetted applicants, and met in open sessions where hearings became local drama. He appeared when required, answered questions about associates and ownership stakes, and accepted conditions attached to approvals. Rumors about skimming floated around the industry for years, and law enforcement pursued such cases where they found evidence, especially at properties linked to different circles later on. In his case, no court verdict tied him personally to a skimming scheme. That distinction mattered to him. He had plenty on the public record already. He didn't need a fresh headline with his name bet on a new allegation. Travelers remember the glamour. Builders remember the spreadsheets. He sweated details that most guests never saw. Credit policies for players, arrangements with junket operators, security protocols that protected the house while still treating patrons with respect, and maintenance schedules that kept air conditioning reliable in unforgiving heat. He valued unions as partners when deals were reasonable and braced for tough bargaining when they weren't. He kept watch over cash, which remained the lifeblood of the business even as checks and wire transfers grew more common. His civic relationships deepened. He worked with city and county officials on roads, utilities, and zoning that would support a modern resort corridor. He spoke with school leaders about growth and with hospital administrators about expansions. He attended events where the guest list included people who had once kept a wary distance. He accepted that some civic leaders would never fully embrace him, and he focused on results they could not ignore. Steady employment, steady tax revenues, and a reputation for reliability in a town that had started as a gamble. None of that erased his history in illegal liquor and unlicensed gaming, or the bribery that came with preserving those businesses in earlier decades. He never denied those chapters when asked directly, though he framed them as a product of their time and as a pathway that led him to a legal industry. He did not claim sainthood. He claimed competence. If a sheriff or senator wanted to cast him as a villain, he could point to legal licenses, audited operations, and a charity ledger. If an admirer tried to paint him as flawless, the public record stood ready to remind them of river towns where law and vice coexisted through a deal sealed with cash. The Desert Inn flourished through the 1,950 seconds. For him, it was proof that a man with a complicated past could build and run a sophisticated enterprise under bright lights and official rules. He was not the face on the marquee, not the singer on stage, not the comic cracking jokes at midnight. He was the one making sure payroll cleared, the showroom's bookings aligned with holidays, the convention calendar smoothed the off-season, and the golf course stayed immaculate for the cameras that loved green grass in a place known for dust. He understood that image mattered, that a resort with grace could soften rough memories, and that time spent serving a community might earn a measure of forgiveness even from skeptics who never forgot where he started. Spotlights swept across the night sky outside his resort while the count room ticked through totals with a rhythm as steady as a metronome. He treated the place like a symphony hall. Every section had a score. Dealers kept pace. Hosts watched players' habits. Cashiers reconciled figures with quiet precision, and the showroom lifted the whole evening with music and jokes that never crossed the line. He prized polish over noise. The phones rang from Los Angeles, Chicago, New York agents asking for dates, wholesalers confirming deliveries, junket operators proposing packages for a holiday weekend. He sorted the chatter into tasks, pressed his staff to land what fit, and left the rest for someone who didn't mind guesswork. He preferred certainty. He had seen what happened when a house got messy. Sheriffs found excuses to visit, headlines multiplied, and lawyers ate weeks that should have gone to building the next attraction. Reporters never forgot the river valleys. They asked about the clubs in northern Kentucky and the way those rooms stayed open. He never pretended the past didn't exist. He acknowledged that he financed and organized gambling in counties where law forbade it, and that the environment of that time relied on understandings with local officials. That meant payoffs bribery by any plain name, so that card rooms and dice tables could operate without constant raids. Arrests came now and then, managers got picked up, equipment was seized, and cases worked through courts. He hired attorneys, posted bonds, and moved personnel as needed. It was a machine designed to absorb pressure. That pattern is what made Nevada so attractive to him. If a state invited gaming and taxed it, a disciplined operator could replace envelopes with licenses and audits. He saw that as progress for him and for the city he was helping build. The hearings that toured the country in the early 1950 seconds put his composure on national display. Senators wanted to know how bootleg earnings turned into hotels with chandeliers, why union pension funds lent millions to projects on a desert highway, and whether men from the old vice circuits still pulled strings from the shadows. He wore a neat suit, sat straight, and chose words that emphasized order over romance. He did not brag about prohibition. He described it as a chapter when the country outlawed a product people kept buying, and he described his role in terms of transportation, logistics, and finance. He admitted that he helped run gambling in towns where it wasn't allowed, and that bribery kept the doors open. He added that Nevada offered a legal path, and that he now worked under that system. The hearings didn't end his career. They set the frame. A man with a complicated past who claimed to have learned how to put those skills to lawful use. Business in Las Vegas demanded more than clean ledgers. It required showmanship executed by other people. He hired talent buyers who could fill a calendar without blowing the budget. He prized for real stars who drew crowds yet respected the resort's rules. No behavior that embarrassed the property, no brawls in the lounge, no headlines that smelled like scandal. In return, performers got good pay, excellent sound, full houses, and a boss who kept his promises. He liked that sort of trade. Strict expectations, generous delivery, and loyalty that grew over time. The golf course extended the brand. Sunlight, green fairways, and televised events turned a desert hotel into a destination for more than gamblers. He understood that you could sell a town not only on thrills, but on comfort. Money to expand had to come from somewhere. Conventional lenders viewed casinos with suspicion in the 1950 seconds. That gave union pension. Funds, especially the Central States Fund, tied to Teamsters a role as financiers. Across the city, developers secured loans through those channels, submitting appraisals, pledging collateral, and paying rates that made the deals attractive for both sides. He and his partners used that route for properties and improvements. Government investigators later dug into the approval processes, the intermediaries who vouched for borrowers, and the histories of those who ended up with large sums. Those inquiries treated the loans as a potential bridge between labor money and people the press labeled underworld figures. He answered with documents, repayment schedules, and the argument that legal vehicles had been used to fund legal projects that yielded tax revenue and jobs. The scrutiny never vanished, but the resorts kept operating, expanding, and paying their bills. His network in Las Vegas widened. He brought in skilled managers, people like Allard Rowan, to run the Desert Inn with calm authority, and linked with younger developers, notably Erwin Molaski and Merv Adelson, who had big ideas about hospitals, shopping centers, and residential projects. Together they formed companies that built beyond the Strip. Sunrise Hospital rose as a modern facility in a town that badly needed it. The Boulevard Mall took shape as a climate-controlled shopping center that signaled a maturing city with stable neighborhoods. The Las Vegas Country Club created a planned community around fairways and lakes, a quiet counterpoint to the neon outside its gates. He liked projects that made a place feel permanent. He believed that if people chose to raise families there, the resorts would have a steadier future. The casinos multiplied nonetheless. The Fremont downtown joined the roster of properties where his circle invested or advised. On the Strip, plans that started under one promoter often ended under another. The Stardust began under Tony Cornero, a swashbuckling figure from earlier gambling scenes who died before finishing it. The project needed fresh money, new management, and a sober approach to get across the line. His partners stepped in to stabilize the effort, and the property opened with a record number of rooms for its day. He didn't place his name on signs or billboards. He placed it on contracts, budgets, and schedules. He understood that public faces came and went. Operational control held value when crowds thinned and notes came due. Regulatory life tightened during the late 1950 seconds and 1960 seconds. Nevada created a control board and a commission with public hearings, background checks, and a willingness to deny licenses if applicants could not satisfy questions about their past. For a man who ran illegal gambling in other states, getting a personal license sometimes posed risks to the properties he cared about. He kept his roles flexible. He served as an executive, consultant, or developer as needed, and he put frontline gaming positions in the hands of people who could meet the letter of the rules. He testified when summoned, took conditions attached to approvals, and avoided open battles with regulators. He never escaped the files that investigators kept. He learned to live with them. Tax authorities looked over his shoulders as well. The cash-heavy nature of casino business attracted audits. He and his companies disputed assessments, negotiated adjustments, and settled where necessary. Public records reflect civil tax disputes, not violent offenses. They show arguments about numbers, documentation, and accounting methods, rather than sensational charges. He approached those conflicts with the same patience he brought to operations. Hire capable counsel, produce records, resist theatrics, and focus on outcomes that let the business continue. The government pushed. He yielded when it made sense. Life moved on. Power in the city shifted with corporate arrivals. Howard Hughes came to stay in a top-floor suite at his resort, and soon bought the property rather than check out when a holiday weekend approached. That sale marked a turning point. Quiet partnerships gave way to corporate owners with public shareholders and different risk appetites. For him, the transition opened time and capital for broader development. He leaned further into building a city offices, medical facilities, stable neighborhoods alongside resorts. He still understood better than almost anyone. It was a logical arc. From bootlegging routes and backroom clubs to licensed casinos, and then to projects that supported a whole metro area. The trail of allegations moved with him. Journalists connected dots from Cleveland to Kentucky to Nevada. They noted friendships that endured across decades and speculated about influence in places that still had opaque corners. He was careful not to taunt critics. He didn't sue every writer. He didn't give long interviews to chase a headline. He let charitable boards, hospital administrators, and civic leaders vouch for him through their projects. If a reporter asked for comment, he offered measured lines. The resorts paid taxes, the hospitals saved lives, the neighborhoods attracted teachers, accountants, and engineers, and the city kept moving forward. He didn't claim sainthood, and he didn't pretend he hadn't financed illegal gambling before moving west. He said he'd chosen to operate where the law allowed it, and to help build institutions that made the place livable. Stories swirled around skimming in various Las Vegas properties over the years, especially in later decades when federal probes cracked cases tied to other groups. Those investigations produced dramatic trials and convictions in operations unrelated to him or coming long after he had stepped away from certain roles. In his case, no court verdict tied him personally to a skimming scheme. That distinction mattered to him. He knew how rumors worked in a town that loved legend as much as fact. He accepted that for some observers, the Prohibition years and the Kentucky clubs made any denial hard to believe. He relied on the simple reality that regulators had never revoked his ability to do business outright, and that the enterprises he touched kept paying their way. He devoted significant energy to Jewish communal life in Las Vegas, supporting synagogues and community centers. and he backed civic causes that crossed lines of faith and neighborhood. Hospital wings bore plaques from fundraising drives he led. Youth programs and scholarship funds received checks. City leaders called him when a project needed a bridge loan or a donor who would set the pace for others. He had a knack for finding practical solutions, bringing a bank to the table, coordinating contractors, or smoothing a zoning snag. The same quality that made him a formidable operator in his earlier life, an ability to manage moving parts and personalities, found a lawful, public outlet in civic work. The contrast in his reputation never disappeared. Judges, mayors, and governors attended dinners where he was honored. At the same time, federal files continued to list him as a figure worth watching, based on associations that predated Las Vegas and on enduring friendships with partners who had been named in vice probes. He might host a charity gala on Saturday and answer questions from investigators on Tuesday. He carried that duality without complaint. He believed that results persuaded more effectively than speeches, and he pointed to buildings, payrolls, and a steady tourism economy as results. If you walked his properties during a weekday afternoon, you saw what he prized: crisp service, clean carpets, immaculate lawns, staff who knew their craft, and managers who didn't panic when a problem cropped up. At night, the glamour returned, but even then the back-of-house hum never changed. He allocated time to teaching younger executives how to handle credit lines, how to spot a nervous accountant, how to read a guest list, and when to call a regulator before a question turned into a problem. He kept notes in tidy handwriting, tracked favors, repaid debts, and expected the same. The ethic: be efficient, be fair within your rules, and don't make enemies you don't need, carried him from laundry routes to boardrooms that looked out over a city he helped shape. The record of offenses remained part of the biography: bootlegging during a national ban on alcohol, the organization and financing of gambling in jurisdictions where it was illegal, and the use of payoffs to safeguard those operations. Those are not rumors. They are acknowledged elements of his early and mid-career life. Later, he battled tax authorities and answered licensing questions, issues rooted in money and oversight rather than force. The absence of violent convictions does not make the earlier acts clean. It simply describes the type of conduct at issue. He understood the difference. He didn't write memoirs full of excuses. He lived long enough to see Las Vegas move from rough-edged outpost to an American destination with schools, hospitals, and parks that families used every day. He preferred to let that arc speak for him. As the 1,960 seconds turned to the 1,970 seconds, he watched new money and new styles arrive on the Strip. Themes grew larger, towers rose higher, and corporations learned the rhythms that he and his peers had been playing by ear. He continued to mentor, to invest selectively, and to guard the reputation of the city's institutions. People would always introduce him as a one-time bootlegger who made good. Others called him a builder whose past could never be erased. He lived with both truths, careful to keep his schedule full and his projects moving, convinced that work visible, durable, and beneficial was the most persuasive argument he could make. By the time the city settled into its 1,972nd stride, he could stand at the edge of a fairway and watch an idea turn into daily life. The Strip had grown from a handful of neon palaces to a corridor of serious businesses, and his place in that shift felt both public and quiet. The moment that signaled a new era arrived when a reclusive industrialist took a long-term suite at his resort, refused to leave when a holiday rush demanded the rooms, and solved the standoff by buying the property outright. That sale changed the balance of power. Corporate money backed by aviation and oil moved in, and the discrete partnerships that had financed early growth gave way to boards, auditors, and layers of management. He adapted without fuss. With the Desert Inn in new hands, he redirected energy and capital toward projects that would make the city livable year-round, not just dazzling on a Saturday night. He and the trusted circle he had built, veteran resort managers and younger developers with a gift for construction and finance, formed development entities that tackled hospitals, homes, and retail. Sunrise Hospital had opened in the late 1,950 seconds with his backing, but the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds were about expansion, modern equipment, specialty wings, and partnerships with physicians who wanted a full-service medical center in a town that had outgrown its frontier clinics. A family could move to Las Vegas now and know a surgeon wasn't 200 miles away. That mattered to him. It made the place feel permanent, A short drive from the Strip, bulldozers traced wide curves for a master-planned enclave around greens and water. The Las Vegas Country Club combined golf, housing, and quiet streets where palms leaned in the wind and neighbors waved from driveways. He liked the balance. Nightlife down the road, calm out the window. The club drew locals and visiting headliners who wanted a round after the late show. Deals were whispered on the tees, but the tone stayed civil and professional. Nearby, a sprawling indoor shopping center opened with anchor stores, climate control, and miles of tile, a sign that Las Vegas had become a city where residents expected more than a souvenir stand and a late-night coffee shop. He helped assemble land, secure financing, and keep the project moving when contractors hit snags. He believed that the same precision that ran a count room could keep a construction schedule on time. The city needed roads, power, water, and schools as much as it needed theaters. He met with county commissioners, utility executives, and educators to align growth with infrastructure. His pitch was simple: if you build the backbone, the private sector will fill in the rest. He delivered his side of that deal with payrolls and properties that paid taxes every quarter. For a man whose name had filled hearing room microphones in another decade, this quieter version of influence suited him. He wasn't a speechmaker. He was a fixer of logistics who preferred to hand over a finished building rather than a clever quote. The past, however, kept tapping on the glass. Reporters and investigators didn't forget the bootlegging routes, the Kentucky roadhouses, or the payoffs that kept illegal rooms open across the river from Cincinnati. They noted that he remained close to longtime partners from Cleveland and northern Kentucky, men named in files during the Prohibition and post-Prohibition years. Those ties were real. He made no secret of them. He argued that people who had learned to manage complex enterprises under pressure could also build cities when given a legal framework. He knew that the same skill set, logistics, finance personnel, had once served unlawful enterprises and now powered hospitals and housing. He didn't pretend the old world had been clean. He acknowledged bribery as part of that mid-century vice economy and said he left it behind when he committed to a state where gaming was lawful and regulated. The regulators in that state did not grant trust easily. Licensing required background checks that went far beyond a handshake. Board meetings were public, and commissioners asked hard questions about ownership structures, silent partners, and whether anyone with a disqualifying past had influence over day-to-day gaming operations. He responded with corporate charts, job descriptions, and arrangements that put direct gaming control in the hands of executives who could meet the standards. He often served as developer, advisor, or investor, roles that didn't demand a personal gaming license, but still placed him at the center of strategy. He understood why the rules were tight. Legal gaming depended on confidence, guests' confidence in fair play, banks' confidence in cash flow, and the state's confidence that operations didn't hide side deals. Financing remained sensitive. Conventional banks slowly warmed to casinos, but still hesitated when gaming projects outnumbered the lender's comfort. Pension funds, especially the Central States Fund associated with Teamsters, continued to bridge gaps. Across Las Vegas, multiple properties documented loans through those channels. Committees in Washington examined how approvals were granted, who vouched for borrowers, and whether the funds were exposed to undue risk. His enterprises appeared in that scrutiny. His answer was pragmatic. The loans were papered, collateralized, and repaid. The projects created jobs. The tax base grew. He kept proof in binders and tried to let results stand as his best defense. The 1,970 seconds also pulled his network toward the coast. A new resort opened in northern San Diego County, a lush getaway built around golf and tennis. The developers were men he had already partnered with in Nevada, and he provided support during its rise. Publications later tried to cast that property as a magnet for men with reputations from earlier decades, folding his name into long articles about influence and ownership. Lawsuits followed. Plaintiffs and defendants traded accusations in courtrooms far from the fairways. Through it all, he kept to his pattern. No dramatic speeches, no public brawls, a reliance on counsel, and a focus on the actual performance of the enterprise. He knew headlines travel farther than corrections. He also knew that courts demanded proof, not legend. Back home, the downtown corridor kept shifting. The Fremont, an elegant tower when it opened, adapted to new tastes with brighter signage and updated gaming floors. His circle had stakes and influence there, and in other properties that required steady management. He spent less time on the floor as years passed, and more time in offices lined with site maps and pro formas. He mentored younger executives on credit policy, compliance, and the delicate art of keeping big players engaged without creating problems that auditors would frown upon later. He reminded them that a fast-talking host could cost a property more than a slow night if the promises outran the rules. Skimming scandals erupted at various properties across the city in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Federal agents documented hidden counts and off-the-books cash movements in certain operations tied to groups that relished notoriety. Trials, convictions, and the fall of owners who had enjoyed brief ascents made headlines nationwide. Those cases did not center on him. By then, he had years of distance from frontline casino roles that would expose him to such charges, and no court judgment linked him personally to those schemes. Still, the uproar affected everyone in the industry. He tightened compliance in ventures where he had influence, counseled caution in hiring, and reminded colleagues that auditors now walked casino floors with sharper eyes and firmer mandates. It was one more example of something he had learned early. Disorder invites trouble. The philanthropic ledger grew thicker. He devoted significant energy to Jewish communal institutions, supported synagogues, and contributed to social service agencies that helped families through hard seasons. Hospital campaigns found in him a willing phone caller and a generous lead donor. He backed scholarships and youth programs, believing that a city with opportunities for children was a city with fewer problems for police and judges. City leaders brought him in when a project needed a nudge, whether that meant a short-term loan, a contractor who could finish a phase, or a quiet conversation that persuaded a reluctant partner to sign. He accepted plaques with modest remarks and moved on to the next task. He had no interest in turning charity into theater. He maintained ties to Cleveland throughout his life. Old friends visited, and he made trips back for weddings, funerals, and the kinds of reunions where people measure how far they've come without announcing it. He donated to causes there too, mindful of a past that began in cold winters and factories that ran night shifts. Detroit and Northern Ohio had taught him how to read a balance sheet, hire good mechanics, and keep trucks moving in snow. Las Vegas had taught him how to work in sunshine under a spotlight that never turned off. He carried both worlds inside him and balanced them with the calm of a man who had spent decades navigating oversight and opportunity. The legal record that shadowed him remained consistent. The core of his criminal exposure rested on three pillars from his earlier decades: the movement of illegal liquor during national prohibition, the financing and management of gambling in jurisdictions where the law forbade it, and the use of payoffs to protect those operations. Those facts appeared in testimony, investigative files, and his own statements before committees that took sworn answers. He did not face convictions for violent offenses, and the later years were defined more by regulatory hearings, tax audits, and licensing conditions than by criminal trials. Tax disputes surfaced periodically, as they did for many cash-intensive businesses in that era. He resolved them with negotiations and settlements, rather than grandstanding. He knew how personal mythology can overtake a life like his. People wanted characters, not managers. They wanted whispers about hidden rooms, not stories about scheduling delivery trucks, so a kitchen never ran out of eggs. He accepted that he'd always be, to some, the bootlegger who funded clubs across the river and then went respectable in the desert. He preferred to be known as the builder who helped turn a stopover into a community. He understood that both images would follow him, and he tried to give journalists and historians something practical to hold: dates, plans, job counts, revenue figures, and buildings that still stood when gossip faded. By the early 1982, he had become the kind of elder statesman who could walk into a county office and be greeted by managers who weren't born when he first arrived in town. He took calls from hospital administrators who needed a donor to open a new wing, and from young entrepreneurs who wanted advice on assembling land for a project near the university. He reminded them that deals lived or died on details, title work, easements, infrastructure, and financing terms, rather than on speeches. He told them to keep their books clean, answer regulators promptly, and treat employees as long-term partners. He didn't glamorize his own path. He said plainly that he came up in an era when a lot of people did illegal things because a constitutional amendment and local statutes drew lines where a market kept moving anyway. He said just as plainly that the modern city gave people a lawful way to build fortunes and legacies, and that they should take it. Even in comfortable years, he stayed alert to winds that could shift. National recessions hit travel budgets. Fuel prices influenced road trips. Airline routes decided whether a city like Las Vegas rose or plateaued. He cultivated relationships with carriers, tourism bureaus, and convention organizers. He argued for practical improvements, more gates at the airport, better signage on highways, land plans that reserved space for schools and parks as neighborhoods expanded. He knew that a tourist town had to function for residents first, or the service everyone came to buy would eventually crack. He kept his own circle small and professional. The same partners who had stood with him through the earliest projects remained nearby. And the younger developers he had mentored took on larger roles as his pace eased. He was never sentimental about titles. He shifted from principal to advisor when that suited a lender or a regulator, and passed opportunities to protégés who could see them through. He measured success not by how often his name appeared, but by whether a project opened on time, filled its rooms, and paid its people. There were honors, quiet and otherwise. Civic groups named him Man of the Year. Hospitals held dinners that featured families thanking donors for the care they had received. He attended when invited, avoided long remarks, and made sure the next fundraiser had what it needed to succeed. He had seen enough grand openings to know that applause fades. What mattered were the Mondays that followed when staff showed up, the cash drawers balanced, and the lights came on for another day. He never rewrote the beginning of his story. He accepted that it included illegal trades, calculated payoffs, and the pivot to a lawful stage where he could deploy the same discipline without dodging sheriffs. He did not preach to those who judged him. He kept building, kept giving, and kept his answers short when old questions surfaced. By then, the city itself was his longest speech, a place with schools, hospitals, homes, and the kind of civic fabric that absorbs shocks because many hands have woven it tight. He knew where he had started and where he had chosen to stand. The golf fairways told a story as clearly as any ledger. When champions walked the desert in course in the 1,950 seconds, television cameras followed, and the city gained a new face in living rooms back east. He helped create that tournament because it pulled Las Vegas out of a niche and into mainstream conversation. It was good for rooms, good for flight bookings, and good for a resort that wanted to be known for more than dice. As the years passed, the event moved across town to another course and eventually to a coastal resort developed by partners he trusted. That arc traced his own path, turn a risky idea into a polished product, then set it where it can endure. He liked seeing a trophy ceremony take place at sunset while hotel lights flickered on and phones began ringing in reservation offices. Corporate change transformed the Strip. A new state law in the late 1960 seconds made it easier for public companies to own casinos. An adjustment that loosened the old guard's grip and brought in boards, auditors, and shareholder reports. He recognized the opportunity and the risk. Corporations came with access to capital and a taste for growth. They also brought layers of oversight that left little room for imprecision. He worked within that reality, selling when the price and timing looked right, and redirecting energy into projects that would make the city stronger away from the gaming floor. Sunrise Hospital expanded again. The shopping center on Maryland Parkway secured new anchor tenants and renovated to match modern retail tastes. A planned golf community matured into a neighborhood where residents strolled at dusk and teenagers pedaled to swimming lessons. He took quiet satisfaction in those scenes. They were not headlines, but they were proof. Compliance grew into an art. Washington passed new rules that required casinos to report large cash transactions and follow documented procedures to deter hidden money. He responded by pushing for training, written policies, and a culture that made paperwork as important as a hot show. Count teams double-checked totals, cashiers filed forms without delay, hosts learned to collect proper identification before extending credit, and managers kept logs that an auditor could review without a fight. He believed that a property should be able to pass an inspection on any day, not just after a warning. He had lived through the kind of scrutiny that came with whispers about hidden counts somewhere else, and he had no interest in exposing his ventures to that sort of damage. The old network still mattered. He kept close to the associates who had stood up the Desert Inn, finished the Fremont, and stabilized the Stardust after early troubles. Allard Rowan remained a trusted operations leader. Erwin Molaski and Merv Adelson proved adept at building beyond the strip medical offices, apartments, and the kind of professional spaces that signaled Las Vegas had serious daytime work, as well as nightlife. Together they formed development companies that took on big jobs with careful cash flow and modest promises to lenders. They finished what they started, which earned them room to try the next thing. A resort on the California coast became a signature project for the younger partners. He supported it with advice, introductions, and credibility that meant something to bankers who remembered his reputation for delivering on time. The place grew famous for golf and tennis, and soon it hosted the same champions who had once walked the fairways in the desert. Journalists chased a different angle. Articles suggested the property drew guests from circles that law enforcement had tracked since Prohibition, and they tied that allegation to the financing that helped build the complex. Lawsuits followed, with owners accusing magazines of painting rumor as fact. The cases stretched for years and ended in settlements that spoke softly compared to the booming claims at the start. Through it all, he kept his public comments limited. He let attorneys speak in courtrooms. He kept running businesses that met payroll and served customers. His own record stayed what it had been for decades: illegal liquor during the national ban, illegal gambling and related bribery in river towns, and then a long tenure as a legal operator, developer, and civic booster in Nevada. Federal files kept his name warm, especially when investigators mapped ties among men who had known one another since the 1920 seconds. He attended hearings when summoned and answered questions in a tone that stayed even. He did not argue that he had always worked inside statute. He argued that he had changed the context of his work as Nevada offered a lawful framework, and that he had lived within that framework for many years. Tax fights still appeared on his calendar. Casinos handle cash, and cash invites extra attention. Assessments rose, accountants filed responses, and negotiations resulted in adjustments. The disputes were civil, not criminal. They ended with paperwork rather than handcuffs. He viewed them as a cost of doing business, not as an injustice. He told younger executives to budget for audits, keep receipts organized, and resist any temptation to blur lines that regulators had very clearly drawn by then. Old habits from the River Valley era, quiet favors and quick envelopes, had no place in a licensed environment that now assumed investigators might review any transaction. He expected his teams to act accordingly. Civic recognition arrived in waves. Community groups honored him for funding hospital wings. Jewish organizations saluted his years of support. One national civil rights group presented an award that drew cheers inside a ballroom and criticism from columnists who argued that a past shaped by bootlegging and illegal gambling was incompatible with accolades for public service. He accepted the honor without gloating and returned to the work that had earned it, raising money for clinics, underwriting social services, and making sure new families arriving in the valley found more than casino shifts waiting for them. He didn't spend time writing letters to the editor. He preferred to open a donor list and start calling. The story of his Las Vegas properties kept evolving. The Fremont adjusted with downtown cycles, adopting brighter signs and modernizing rooms. The Stardust went through phases with different owners and managers, some of whom later faced federal heat unrelated to him. The Desert Inn flourished under corporate control, and then shifted again as the city reinvented itself under fresh CEOs. At each turn, he had choices. He could cling or pivot. He usually chose the pivot. He reallocated capital to ventures where his team could control outcomes, and he resisted invitations to step into public roles that would drag him back into daily gaming operations. He liked being a phone call away rather than a microphone away. He never stopped coaching the next generation. He taught rising managers to treat regulators as partners rather than enemies, to document decisions, and to share information early when a problem developed. He told them to avoid outrage as a strategy. Calm answers and clean files solved most conflicts. He urged hospitality teams to remember that a resort's reputation rests on every interaction, from the bell desk to the cage, and that one corner cut by a careless supervisor could undo years of careful work. He had learned this from harsh experience. A single headline can burn for months in a town built on confidence. He kept a line open to Cleveland. Not for business in Ohio, where his days as an operator ended long before, but for the human ties that start in youth and last through funerals and holidays. The men who had once run distribution during Prohibition grew old together. Some passed. He made time to attend memorials, write checks to their family causes, and remember the grit of a time when money moved on back roads and problems appeared in the rearview mirror. He never romanticized that period. He treated it as reality from an era when a lot of Americans made decisions they wouldn't recommend to their grandchildren. The city he helped shape demanded more from leaders each year. Tourism grew, but so did traffic and classroom counts. He pressed for airport expansion, backed bond issues for schools, and talked to water managers about the long arc of growth in a desert. He knew that a healthy metro area protected the very businesses that first drew him west. He also knew that a reputation built on glitz could fray if residents felt neglected. So he lent his name to initiatives that were dull but vital: sewer lines, road widenings, utility upgrades. Those projects didn't get celebrities to pose for photos, but they kept the city's heart beating. He lived with contradictions. Agencies kept files on him. Charities kept plaques for him. Some neighbors waved when he walked into a room. A few scowled. He accepted both reactions without flinching because he understood the source of each. When asked directly about the bootlegging years and the gambling rooms in Kentucky, he explained the facts cleanly. Yes, he participated in those activities. Yes, bribery protected them. Yes, he moved away from that model when he chose a state that licensed gaming and demanded accountability. He didn't offer theatrics. He offered the record, a long stretch of legal operations, audited finances, transparent partnerships, and a civic ledger thick with gifts. Teamsters loans remained a topic neighbors whispered about, especially among people who had followed national hearings on pension fund abuses. He could not deny that properties in his circle borrowed from the Central States Fund when traditional lenders balked. He also emphasized that the loans went through paperwork, collateral, and repayments. When rules changed and regulators tightened oversight of pension investments, he and his partners refinanced through banks that were now more comfortable with an industry run by corporations and watched by stronger state agencies. It was another pivot, dictated by policy rather than taste. He had a knack for reducing complex questions to workable steps. If a project needed land assembled from dozens of parcels, he hired title experts and sent patient negotiators. If a wing of a hospital stalled waiting for equipment deliveries, he found a way to bridge the gap so installation could proceed. If a city agency hesitated over a permit, he asked what documentation would resolve the issue and produced it. He built trust through performance, not speeches. People learned that if he said a building would be ready by summer, they could plan a ribbon cutting and send invitations. As the 1,980 seconds advanced, Las Vegas welcomed new attractions, from mega shows to themed resorts that made the old neon look modest. He watched the transformation with interest rather than nostalgia. He had seen cycles. He understood that every generation wants to put its stamp on the skyline. He chose not to compete for the flashiest project. He chose to fill the gaps that flashy projects leave behind: medical services, offices, housing, and the civic glue that makes growth sustainable. He visited job sites less frequently but kept a hand in budgets and schedules. His counsel carried weight because it was grounded in decades of finished work. Through every season, the same ledger of wrongdoing defined the illegal portion of his life. Smuggling liquor when national law forbade it, financing and organizing gambling where it was banned, and using payoffs to keep those rooms open. There were arrests in those years, and the occasional indictment for gambling violations in local courts. Convictions that transformed his status did not materialize. Later, conflicts involved taxes and licensing, matters fought on paper and in hearing rooms. No proof in court tied him to violent acts, and no verdict attached his name to the skimming scandals that took down other operators in later periods. He guarded those distinctions without pretending they canceled the rest. He accepted the blemishes and insisted on the differences that mattered to him. He did something else that mattered to him. He helped people one by one. A scholarship paid for a young person's first year at college. A medical bill got covered quietly for a family that had nowhere else to turn. A retiring employee found a path to keep health coverage. Those acts rarely landed in print, but they added up to an influence far beyond a casino floor. He came from a family laundry where the work started before sunrise and ended when customers were satisfied. That ethic never left him. It shaped the way he handled both favors and obligations. The farther he moved from those early days along the Ohio River, the more he understood that the final accounting on his name would be mixed. He was at peace with that. He had lived openly for a long time, under scrutiny that would have sent a thinner man into hiding. He had testified on television and posed for photos with doctors receiving donations for new equipment. He had helped write the city's growth story in numbers anyone could verify. Beds, payrolls, square footage, tax receipts, and patient counts. For him, those numbers meant more than adjectives applied by admirers or critics. Near the end of that decade, his calendar slowed a little. Younger executives ran meetings he once led. He still asked smart questions, still scanned balance sheets with a mechanic's eye, and still told stories about inventory headaches in the laundry trade that could teach a casino manager something about cash control. He didn't cling to the past. He shared it as instruction for people willing to learn. He left the rest to historians and columnists, certain they would argue over motives long after the buildings he helped raise had outlasted them all. He carried himself like someone who had learned to value steadiness above drama. By the time the 1,980 seconds settled over the valley, he woke early, read reports, and measured progress in quiet metrics. Occupancy trends. Cash flow. Charity pledges met. Permits approved. The skyline got taller, the crowds younger, the shows louder. But he stayed constant an organizer, with a long memory and a calendar shaped by projects rather than parties. He moved through lobbies at a measured pace, greeting employees by name, asking about family, then slipping into meetings where budgets, timelines, and regulatory filings ruled the day. The glamour happened around him. The work ran through him. The tournament he helped bring to life long ago still rippled across his schedule. The old champions who first played the Desert Inn fairways had introduced the country to an image of Las Vegas that involved sunlight, sportsmanship, and a tidy green oasis carved into desert sand. When the event moved to another local course, and then later to a coastal resort his partners developed, he watched with the satisfaction of a builder who sees an idea outgrow its first address. The pageantry sold rooms and airline seats, but it also sold a feeling this is a place where things are done right. He liked that message because it fit the image he wanted for the city and for himself. The rooms he now spent the most time building weren't suites or showrooms. They were hospital wards and medical offices. He continued to invest in the facility on Maryland Parkway that he and his circle had helped create decades earlier. New wings added intensive care beds, neonatal units, and specialized services that once required an ambulance ride to another state. Those projects didn't draw magazine covers, but they drew gratitude, and they signaled that Las Vegas had moved from improvised medicine to modern care. He chaired fund drives, wrote his own checks, and coaxed friends to do the same. He believed that philanthropy should be relentless and practical. Identify a need. Fund it. Finish it. Move to the next. He kept building neighborhoods too. The golf community he had helped plan matured into an address where school buses hissed to a stop each morning and porch lights blinked on at dusk. Nearby, the shopping center expanded and reconfigured as national retailers changed formats. He negotiated leases, balanced tenant mixes, and authorized upgrades when a wing felt dated. He treated retail the way he treated casinos: clean floors, ready staff, reliable air conditioning, and managers who kept promises. The principle was simple. If you respect customers' time, they come back. Work in the 1,980 seconds required fluency and compliance. Laws born in an era of financial scandals demanded casinos track and report cash movements in more detail than ever before. He supported training that made forms and thresholds part of daily routine. Staff learned to file reports on large transactions, to verify identities, and to escalate irregularities without fuss. He insisted the back of house could pass an inspection on any random day. He had no appetite for shortcuts. He had lived through too many chapters where rumor punished even the blameless, and he would not give observers an easy story. His early life remained part of every dossier and many conversations. He didn't shrink from it when asked, but he didn't indulge nostalgia. He described bootlegging as logistics during a national ban, a business of drivers, boats, storage, and distribution across borders that a thirsty market ignored. He acknowledged that he helped finance and organize gambling in towns where the law forbade it. And he acknowledged that bribes kept those rooms operating, cash to local officials so raids were rare, quick legal help when a crackdown came, and a steady rotation of staff to cushion the impact when arrests occurred. Those were the facts of his early and middle years, and they appeared in investigative files, newspaper stories, and hearing transcripts. He also noted that Nevada offered a different path, and that he had spent the bulk of his later life inside a regulated industry, with audits, licensing reviews, and ongoing scrutiny. Regulators sometimes signaled that his history made a personal gaming license difficult. He adapted. He took roles that emphasized development, finance, and strategy, leaving direct gaming control to executives who met the state's standards. Corporate structures clarified responsibilities and demonstrated that people with clean files ran table games and cages. He appeared when summoned, answered questions about associates, and accepted conditions designed to keep operations transparent. That approach didn't erase skepticism, but it allowed projects to open, function, and pay taxes. Financing remained a story others told for him, often with an angle. When pension funds connected to a major union stepped in during a time when banks were wary, properties across the city, including some he backed, borrowed through those channels. Later, investigations reviewed those loans in detail, asking whether approvals reflected sound judgment and whether borrowers were properly vetted. He responded with repayment records, collateral documentation, and the plain argument that lawful instruments funded lawful enterprises that employed thousands. Over time, as public corporations and large banks embraced gaming, he and his partners refinanced old debt into conventional arrangements. The paper trail pivoted with the industry. He kept lines open to civic leaders. He met with county commissioners about airport expansions, with water authorities about long-term supply, with school officials about new campuses in growing neighborhoods. He understood the invisible network behind growth pipes, runways, substations, and zoning maps. He helped where he could, often as a bridge between public plans and private dollars. He believed that a city earns resilience through boring projects finished on schedule. That outlook didn't make him a celebrity. It made him useful. Controversy still arrived on cue. A national magazine ran a long feature linking a luxury resort on the coast, one his partners developed with his early support to the social orbit of men with reputations from mid-century vice. The piece painted a picture of fairways and cabanas as meeting places for figures who, the article claimed, had migrated from illicit businesses to sunshine. The developers sued for libel, arguing that the reporting blurred rumor and fact. The case stretched, motions piled up, and the eventual resolution landed with less noise than the original splash. Through it all, he stuck to his pattern. He avoided public feuds, let counsel do the arguing, and concentrated on the performance of the properties he could control. He also stood in ballrooms to accept honors that created their own debates. One prominent civil rights organization presented him with an award for civic service, spotlighting hospital work and steady support for community programs. Some commentators criticized the decision, pointing to his prohibition background and illegal gambling years. He did not respond with op-eds or interviews. He thanked the organizers, expressed gratitude for the city that had embraced growth, and went back to fundraising and problem-solving. He knew that reputations are composite things. People see what they wish to see. Buildings, payrolls, and patient counts gave the most reliable testimony in his view. Back downtown, the Fremont and nearby properties adjusted to competition from the Strip's newer megasorts. He worked with managers who tightened operations, refreshed floors, and courted conventions that liked the walkable core. He believed downtown would always matter because it offered a different texture. Compact, energetic, and grounded in the city's earliest identity. He did not try to make every venue everything, to everyone. He taught teams to know their audience and serve it well. He kept the old friendships alive. The Cleveland Circle that had built ventures together since the 1,920 seconds had thinned. Time takes partners as surely as risk. He attended funerals, visited hospitals, and quietly supported the families of men with whom he had shared victories and storms. He did not disavow those relationships to earn applause. He recognized that loyalty, rightly directed, could exist without clinging to outdated methods. He told younger colleagues that history should guide judgment, not paralyze it. The river towns where he once operated changed too. The glamorous clubs that had defined northern Kentucky's vice scene in the 1,930 seconds and 1,940 seconds were long gone by the 1,970 seconds, and a tragedy in Southgate during that decade scarred the region's memory. He had no connection to that event. He had left that world long before. Still, The fire reminded him how buildings and reputations can live on beyond their intended purposes, carrying echoes of eras people prefer to forget. He thought about that whenever a reporter tried to stitch his name into any new story about the old geography. He stuck to what he knew and to what he could stand behind. Compliance tightened across the industry as law enforcement dismantled skimming operations in certain properties controlled by different circles. Those cases produced headlines, convictions, and lore that reached far beyond Nevada. None of that touched him in court. And by then, he stood at a professional distance from roles where such schemes might have been alleged. He responded to the overall environment by emphasizing internal controls, third-party audits, and a culture where honesty outranked hustle. He reminded managers that reputational risk could cost more than any single month's profit. He kept his personal life off stage. He granted a few interviews and wrote no memoirs. He preferred to communicate through action, finishing buildings, funding scholarships, backing community centers, and responding to civic needs quickly. He believed that a leader's phone should ring when a hospital needed equipment or when a housing project stalled. He took those calls. He had time for people who brought plans instead of grievances. He had time for young professionals too. He met with aspiring developers, accountants, and hospitality managers at early breakfasts, asked them to summarize their aims in a page, and critique the plans without cruelty. He told them to protect their names, to avoid short-term wins that damaged long-term credibility, and to treat regulators as part of the system rather than as adversaries. He shared the lesson the hard years had stamped on him. The difference between a problem and a scandal is almost always how you handle it the first week. The old charges remained well-known and uncomplicated in their essence. He had participated in bootlegging during Prohibition. He had helped finance and run gambling in jurisdictions that prohibited it. He had used payoffs to keep those rooms open, a standard practice in that illicit economy. He had been arrested during raids and faced local charges tied to gambling violations. He navigated those encounters with lawyers, bail, and an unflappable temperament. Later, he had weathered tax audits and licensing scrutiny, settling disputes and structuring roles to satisfy regulators. No court had tied his name to violent acts, and no verdict had connected him personally to the skimming scandals that dismantled certain later operations. He saw no point in pretending otherwise. He acknowledged what he had done and argued that he had spent the balance of his life proving he could deploy his skills under law. On certain afternoons, he would walk a property and let memories overlap the laundry shop where he learned machinery and margins, the river routes where trucks rolled under moonlight, the roadhouses with orchestras and back rooms that demanded precise accounting and iron discipline, the hotel floors that gleamed on opening nights, the hospital corridors where a new machine beeped softly next to a patient, now being treated in the city rather than flown out. He found a kind of order in that sequence. The same insistence on systems, on plain math, on promises kept, ran through it all. He knew time was finite. He began to organize archives, to make sure documents from decades of work ended in libraries where future researchers could separate fact from myth. He encouraged partners to do the same. He understood that a life like his would always invite simplified narratives: saint, sinner, mastermind, civic father. He had lived inside the messier truth, and he wanted records that reflected it. He believed that transparency could serve him even after he was gone. The 1,980 seconds did not soften him into sentimentality. He remained practical, cautious, insistent that details matter, and quick to recognize when a project needed a new steward. He transferred responsibilities to protégés who had earned trust. He retained enough involvement to help in moments of stress, and stepped back enough to let the next generation learn. He had seen leaders cling too long. He chose a different exit. Evenings found him at small tables rather than head tables. He preferred dinners where strategy could be discussed without microphones. He enjoyed stories from old friends, laughter when it came, and the simple comfort of a city that felt like his handiwork without ever needing to say so. He left it to others to debate whether a man with his early record could be an honored civic figure. He held to the quieter conviction that a city's health justifies hard work, and that redemption, if it exists in public life, shows up in the institutions that survive you: hospitals, neighborhoods, and a culture that values order over chaos. He carried those beliefs into each morning's file stack. Another permit needed a letter. Another fundraiser needed a chair. Another young manager needed a nudge toward caution over speed. The work had a rhythm he recognized from long ago. Open the shop, check the machines, meet the route drivers, balance the drawer, and close the door, ready to do it again. He had traded steam and starch for neon and medical-grade lighting, but the routine was the same. It kept him balanced in a town that rarely encouraged that quality, and in a life that had tested it from the start. Morning light slid across a desk stacked with site plans, charitable pledges, and monthly reports. He liked the order of it. The town around him raced ahead with ever bigger towers and louder stages, but his day still began with numbers, timelines, and people who needed clear direction. Meetings ran on time. Calls to City Hall were polite and focused. A hospital administrator might step in at noon to review a new piece of equipment the fundraising committee wanted to underwrite. A young manager from downtown might arrive with questions about credit procedures for a convention crowd. He'd listen, weigh options, and pick the course that kept risk controlled and relationships intact. The job hadn't changed, not really. The scale had. What had changed was the rhythm of the strip. Corporate names crowned marquees. Project finance came through bond markets as often as from a single lender. Public filings replaced handshake understandings. He watched the shift without complaint. He had spent years urging colleagues to document everything and to treat oversight as a constant, not an interruption. In that culture, the habits he had learned over decades, clean books, exact roles, early communication with regulators, became industry norms. He found that reassuring. It meant the city had outgrown the volatile cycles that once made every headline feel like a threat. Away from Las Vegas Boulevard, his fingerprints remained visible. The master-planned neighborhood around fairways and lakes had matured into a true community, complete with high-rise residences and quiet streets, where kids raced scooters and retirees walked dogs under palm shade. He kept an eye on maintenance budgets, landscaping contracts, and security staffing, not because he craved control, but because he believed long-term value was earned through consistency. The shopping center on Maryland Parkway kept evolving, absorbing new anchors and rolling out renovations to match national retail trends. He was old enough to remember when a single store's delay could make or break a season. He never lost that sense of urgency about fittings, permits, and opening dates. The city's backstage grew more sophisticated too. Airport expansions demanded coordination among local officials, airlines, and federal agencies. He worked phones to back the plans that would add gates and modernize facilities, knowing that a tourism economy rises or falls with airlift and convenience. Water managers presented long horizon charts measuring supply against growth. He understood the stakes. Meetings in quiet conference rooms about pipes and reservoirs never sold tickets, but they sustained a metropolis in a desert. He gave his time and reputation to those efforts because he believed in tying private growth to public capacity. The narrative that followed him into every one of those rooms never disappeared. People knew how he started. As a young man, he had moved liquor during a national ban that created a market too profitable for many to ignore. He had helped finance and manage wagering in river counties, where lawmen looked the other way in exchange for payments that kept the peace on the surface. Raids came and went. Charges landed on managers more often than financiers, and lawyers became as essential as dealers in that trade. Those facts weren't myth. They were embedded in transcripts, investigative memos, and the rare public remarks he made when sworn to tell the truth before committees that toured the country. He didn't varnish it when asked. He acknowledged it, then pointed to the years he had spent in a legal jurisdiction where auditing, licensing, and taxes defined the framework. Cash-heavy businesses attracted another type of attention. Accountants from government agencies carrying clipboards. He had his share of tax disputes, especially in periods when rules for depreciation, cash reporting, or deductions shifted under changing federal policy. Those confrontations ended with paperwork, not jail cells. Assessments were argued down, documentation was produced, positions were adjusted, and checks were written where necessary. He taught protégés that these were not personal battles. They were part of the operating environment. Keep records, hire competent counsel, respect the process, and get back to work. The loans that built parts of the strip in the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds stayed in the public conversation as well. When traditional lenders hesitated, pension funds tied to a powerful union made mortgages that filled the gap. Properties across town used that money, including projects within his circle. Investigations later poured over the approval chains, asked whether borrowers were vetted well enough, and questioned whether trustees exercised the care required by law. His position held steady. The notes were signed, collateral pledged, installments paid, and projects completed. Over time, as national banks changed their stance on gaming, those debts were replaced with conventional financing. If critics wanted to argue that early capital had carried reputational risks, he answered that the city many millions now visited would not have been built without someone stepping in while banks sat on the fence. Stories about a certain coastal resort followed him as well, mostly because two of his closest Las Vegas partners had created it. The place won headlines for its campus of courts and fairways, and then won a different kind of attention when journalists suggested it doubled as a social hub for men with histories rooted in vice. Lawsuits ensued. Plaintiffs alleged irresponsible reporting. Editors defended their work. The legal fight lasted years and closed without the resounding victory either side would have preferred. He kept his distance from the microphones, limited his public comments to brief statements of support for his colleagues, and returned to the beats he knew best: funding hospitals, stewarding neighborhoods, and smoothing the kind of business disputes that never make front pages. He also stood at podiums in banquet halls lit with chandeliers. Awards came his way from civic and religious groups that valued his philanthropy, especially in healthcare. One honor from a prominent national organization sparked debate. Admirers recited a ledger of clinics built and programs funded. Detractors cited decades-old dossiers and asked whether a past shaped by illicit ventures should be followed by applause. He did not campaign for the recognition, and he did not apologize for accepting it. In remarks that lasted only a few minutes, he thanked the people who had done the daily work in wards and offices, urged continued giving, and stepped down without seeking the last word. He believed that a city's well-being mattered more than any single headline, favorable or critical. Walks through downtown remained part of his routine. The Fremont's managers rotated, renovated, and refreshed. He liked to step onto the floor early in the day, check sight lines, inspect carpets, test the feel of air conditioning against the summer heat, and chat with desk clerks about occupancy patterns. A few steps away, other properties adjusted to the competition flowing south along the strip. He advised without hovering. Teams deserved space to run, but they also benefited from reminders delivered by someone who had seen 1,000 cycles. Don't extend credit faster than you can collect. Don't let a shiny promotion obscure compliance rules. Don't confuse a good weekend with a strong quarter. Mentoring became a daily practice. Breakfasts with young developers turned into tutorials on titles, easements, and phasing. Afternoons with hospitality managers became conversations about policies for large cash transactions, and the art of asking for identification without turning a routine interaction into friction. He taught by story when it helped. A memory of a small mistake in a Kentucky card room that later forced a big correction. A recollection from the early Desert Inn days, when a vendor's late delivery nearly derailed an opening, and a reminder that one hurried promise to a celebrity's agent could morph into a compliance headache no one needed. He did not underline his lessons with drama. He underlined them with outcomes. Better files, fewer surprises, smoother audits. Old friendships endured. Men from Cleveland and northern Kentucky who had weathered the same storms shared meals and laughter that arrived more often as reminiscence than as planning. They had survived the years when a single phone call could close a club, and the years when a committee in Washington could turn private names into public fodder. Time took some of them. He attended services, hugged family, and wrote checks to causes they would have approved. He did not renounce his past associations to find favor with new acquaintances. He simply lived in the present, convinced that loyalty could coexist with a commitment to lawful business. Around him, Las Vegas entered another reinvention. Themed resorts rose with pyramids, castles, and volcanoes. Family-friendly advertising joined neon in the city's vocabulary. He smiled at the ambition and declined any invitation to join the race for spectacle. His contribution to this phase came in the form of infrastructure and stability. He advocated for road improvements that would ease bottlenecks, for school construction bonds that would keep pace with subdivisions, and for public safety budgets that recognized a fast-growing city's needs. He preferred ribbon cuttings for bridges and clinics to fireworks at a grand opening, not because he lacked appreciation for flair, but because he had come to believe that the quiet achievements last longer. He spoke rarely about the law enforcement files that tracked him for decades. They were part of his weather. From the 1,930 seconds through the 1,960 seconds, municipal police, state agencies, and federal offices kept notes on his movements, partners, and business arrangements. Some of those memos concluded more than the evidence warranted. Some hit close to home. In formal settings, grand juries, licensing hearings, Senate panels, he held to what documentation could support. Illegal liquor in the Prohibition era? Yes. Unlicensed gambling in the Ohio River Valley? Yes. Payments that insulated those clubs from constant disruption? Yes. Violence as a method? Not his trade. And the public record never tied his hand to it. Skimming in the big scandals that rocked the industry in later years? Not proven in his case. And by then he was already operating at a remove from the roles that would have exposed him to such charges. Those lines, drawn plainly, framed his view of his own life. Private life stayed private. He ate dinner at small tables, not dais seats, often with a handful of colleagues and friends. Conversation covered current projects, community needs, the fortunes of teams back in Ohio, and the inevitable stories that come up when people who have known each other for half a century share a meal. He liked jokes well told, plans well drawn, and nights that ended early enough that the next morning could start on time. Fame had never been the aim. Function was. By the late 1,980 seconds, he had begun to prepare for absence. Files were organized, obligations listed, charitable commitments calendared well into the future. He wanted no scrambling, no unanswered calls, no surprises for partners or beneficiaries. The collections of letters, contracts, and clippings that traced his arc from laundry routes to boardrooms were sorted and steered toward libraries where researchers could look beyond rumor. He thought it important that future readers see a record that showed both the illicit beginnings and the lawful decades, because the city he helped build was born of contradictions, and history deserved clarity. He still visited job sites when a wing neared completion. Fresh paint and the smell of new flooring put a spring in his step. He'd run a hand along a railing, compliment a foreman on a tidy punch list, and remind the project manager to schedule a walkthrough with the city inspector a few days earlier than necessary to leave room for fixes. These were small gestures that added up to a standard. Be ready, be early, be thorough. He hoped that outlasted him more than any marquee ever could. Conversations with newcomers often turned toward reputation. They had read a headline or watched a documentary clip and wanted to reconcile the contradictions. He resisted the impulse to narrate his life as a clean arc from darkness to light. He offered instead a set of facts. As a young man, he chose profit in markets the law had closed. He helped run wagering that statutes forbade in particular counties. That required payments to public officials who accepted them. Later, he chose to move his work to a state that licensed gaming, subjected operators to regulation, and taxed the proceeds. In that environment, he built hotels, golf courses, neighborhoods, medical facilities, and a network of civic institutions that benefited the whole community. He was investigated, audited, and questioned throughout. He adapted, answered, and continued. People could decide what weight to assign each chapter, but they ought to read the whole book. He knew that very few lives end with a period. Most close with an ellipsis, a trailing line of obligations passed to other hands. He took comfort in the faces of younger managers who had internalized the ethic he'd preached: tidy operations, transparent relations with oversight, respect for workers and guests, and a bias for finishing. He saw it in the way a hospital administrator prepared a budget, in the way a downtown GM reviewed security logs, in the way a developer's assistant double-checked a title report before closing. Those were his kind of victories, quiet, durable, and invisible to anyone not paying attention. On some afternoons, he walked the grounds of the golf club that had long served as a kind of civic commons for the city's professional class. The fairways were still emerald against sand and sky. Groups teed off under broad sun. A cluster of kids chipped near a practice green. A couple posed for a photo with the skyline behind them. He considered how unlikely it would have seemed 5 decades earlier that such scenes would be ordinary in this place. The improbable had become routine because people insisted on it, organized it, and funded it. That had been his small part: to insist, to organize, to fund. As twilight came, windows lit up along the strip. New towers gleamed beside landmarks he had helped midwife into existence. He did not keep a scrapbook. The city itself was his scrapbook. It had been hard on him at times and generous at others. He had been hard on it at times, pushing for standards that some thought excessive, and for compromises that others thought too gentle. Yet the exchange had been honest. He gave the place what he could, and it gave him a chance to turn skills honed in one world into results acceptable in another. He considered that fair. He considered it enough for now, with another day's list waiting on the desk and a few more promises to keep before the file drawers closed for someone else to open. He measured days by what got done. A letter left the desk with a signature he had practiced to a steady hand. A permit cleared after a call, where he asked the right question at the right moment. A pledge turned into a funded machine in a hospital wing that would save lives without fanfare. The rhythm of that work steadied him late in life. He didn't look for absolution in headlines or applause in banquet halls. He looked for finished projects, paid invoices, and teams that knew their jobs so well that a surprise became rare. Travelers saw spectacle. He saw systems. He liked walking through a property before most guests woke up, hallways quiet, lobby staff changing shifts, a maintenance crew finishing a night's work. No one would ever notice unless it failed. Early hours let him think about the long trail he had walked. He could trace a line from a laundry's steam and starch to a desert resort's polished brass, from a river dock where crates moved in silence to an office where a county official signed off on a zoning map after months of careful preparation. The tools changed. The discipline did not. Hospitals remained his anchor. Engineers wheeled in new equipment, donors took a tour, and nurses described how a small adjustment in a floor plan saved steps during emergencies. He listened closely. If a detail shaved seconds in a crisis, it mattered as much as any contract he'd ever signed. He pushed fund drives with the same persistence he once applied to opening nights. When administrators struggled to bridge a budget gap for another expansion, he made the calls that brought shy donors into the circle and wrote checks that signaled seriousness. Those corridors, bright and clean, felt like the strongest answer to those who questioned what a man with his beginnings could give a city. He had no interest in myth-making. If someone at a lunch asked how a kid from a family laundry ended up in charge of casinos and construction projects, he didn't embellish. He explained the eras. During Prohibition, he worked in a trade that took advantage of a ban many ignored, moving liquor across borders through routes that had to be reliable and discreet. In the decades after, he helped finance and manage gambling rooms in counties where such operations were illegal, and he acknowledged that bribes protected those rooms from constant disruption. Arrests came, charges landed mostly on managers, and lawyers turned chaos into calendar entries. Those facts lived in testimony and files. Later, he shifted to Nevada, where gaming was legal, regulated, and taxed, and he spent the rest of his career operating within that framework. The story was not clean, but it was consistent. He also talked about the invisible infrastructure that made Las Vegas survivable. Airport runways lengthened, baggage systems modernized, and terminals expanded because committees met, reports were read, and budgets cleared. Water policy, so dull on the surface, became the backbone of growth. He supported projects that improved delivery and storage because he knew a city in the Mojave could not live on optimism. School construction rolled forward. Fire stations and clinics opened. He stood with officials for many of those ribbon cuttings, not because he craved a camera, but because he believed that private builders should show up when public investment took the strain of growth. The questions about his associations never vanished. People remembered the Cleveland names that had traveled with him through decades of business. They returned to the Northern Kentucky clubs, where orchestras played in grand rooms while games spun quietly in the back, and to the payoffs that kept those operations on a glide path between raids. They recalled the Senate hearings where he appeared in a suit and tie, speaking in measured phrases about logistics, finance, and the transition to a lawful industry. They raised again the issue of loans from a powerful union's pension fund. During years when traditional banks shied away from casinos, he did not dismiss any of it. He emphasized repayment records and collateral for those loans, the public oversight under which Nevada gaming operated, and his decision to build institutions that served the entire community. He left the rest to historians. He learned to shrug at stories that tried to fold every resort he had ever touched into a single narrative about influence. A celebrated property on the coast became a magnet for speculation, which became a lawsuit, which became a settlement that left almost everyone dissatisfied. He stayed out of shouting matches, He believed in courts and contracts as the proper places for those arguments. He kept returning to the same ground. Run clean operations, keep documentation tight, welcome audits, and build things that help families as much as tourists. He came to see mentoring as a responsibility. Mornings brought coffee with a young accountant puzzling over a compliance threshold. Afternoons brought a walkthrough with a developer, learning how to stage construction so tenants could open on time without exhausting cash. He told stories that made rules human. A forgotten receipt that turned into a big tax bill. A vendor relationship that soured because a promise outpaced the purchase order. A star entertainer whose agent tried to skate past policies designed to keep a casino out of trouble. He encouraged patience, precision, and honesty. He urged people to accept that regulators do not disappear for good or ill. They return, and they remember. Recognition arrived even when he didn't seek it. Civic clubs hosted luncheons where plaques changed hands and donors were thanked. A national group dedicated to fighting hate honored him for his long record of giving, especially in healthcare. The program included warm introductions and polite applause. Commentators outside the room repeated the old debate, pointing to his early life and asking whether such a past should disqualify a person from honor. He declined to arm wrestle in print. He kept inviting people to tour hospital wings, to meet social workers helping families, to visit community centers after school let out. He believed that if you wanted to judge him, you should see what his money and effort had made before you reached a verdict. He did not spend his last years dusting trophies. He spent them arranging successions. Development companies that had once needed his signature on every document now moved with executives he had trained. He insisted on clarity in buy-sell agreements, on clean lines of authority, and on charitable commitments set out in writing so that generosity would continue when his phone stopped ringing. He met with lawyers to make sure archives would be preserved. Boxes of correspondence, agreements, and clippings went to collections where serious readers could study a full record instead of one slice to fit a headline. In private, he allowed himself small pleasures. He liked a perfect tee shot, a well-cooked steak, and the way a lobby sounds when a bell captain manages a rush without raising his voice. He enjoyed old jokes told well and new ideas presented with quiet confidence. He avoided bitterness. He knew people who had taken rougher paths and paid heavier prices. He had survived eras that crushed others because he preferred structure over chaos, and because, at crucial moments, he chose to move his abilities into a legal frame that let him go on building. He died in Las Vegas in 1989, 89 years old. A winter baby who had lived long enough to watch a desert town turn into a metropolis that filled TV screens worldwide. Services brought out a cross-section of the city hoteliers and housekeepers, doctors and developers, elected officials and old friends from Cleveland, and a stack of obituaries that told two stories at once. One called him a central figure in early vice trades who adapted without apology. The other called him a builder whose philanthropy gave the city essential institutions. Both were true in their way. That was the paradox he had carried with unflustered calm. After the funeral, the work he had set in motion did not pause. Hospital projects he had funded continued. Neighborhoods he had helped plan matured. Properties he once developed kept running under managers who had internalized his standards. Debates about his reputation rolled on, as debates always do. Some writers emphasized the bootlegging years, the illegal gambling rooms across the river, and the admitted bribes that maintained them. Others emphasized legal casinos run under licenses, audit trails that satisfied regulators, a record free of violent convictions, and a civic ledger thick with gifts. The full picture required patience. An early career on the wrong side of the law, a midlife pivot onto a regulated stage, and a later life devoted to building and giving in ways that had tangible results. People still ask what his crimes were, as if a clean list could solve the riddle. The list is straightforward. During Prohibition, he participated in the illegal liquor trade. In the years that followed, he financed and managed gambling in places where it was against the law. Those operations depended on bribes that compromised officials and protected clubs from constant closure. He was arrested and charged during that period in connection with gambling violations, and he answered those encounters through lawyers and bail. He later faced tax disputes, civil matters about assessments and documentation, and years of licensing scrutiny in Nevada. No court found him responsible for violent acts, and no verdict tied him to the later skimming cases that toppled other operators. Those are the facts that belong on the record. People also ask what he built. as if construction could purchase forgiveness. The list is straightforward there too. He helped rescue and run a resort that introduced a more refined vision of Las Vegas and brought national sports to its fairways. He backed downtown and strip properties that helped define the city's hospitality economy. He co-founded development firms that built a major hospital, a regional shopping center, and a master-planned neighborhood that signaled permanence. He gave to synagogues and civic groups. He raised funds for medical equipment and community services. He mentored managers who carried those standards into the next decades. Those are the works that bear his fingerprints. He never asked for a statue. He asked for competence. He asked people to do what they said they would do and to keep records that proved it. He believed that cities thrive on that habit more than on flair. He had lived long enough to see himself cast as both villain and benefactor. He suspected that anyone who builds at scale acquires critics and admirers in equal measure, and that the ratio matters less than the durability of the work left behind. Walk a path he favored, and you can still read his priorities. The fairways lie trim against the desert, a green thesis that a city can craft comfort where nature offers none. A hospital wing hums with machines that families rely on without ever learning the names of the donors who paid for them. A shopping concourse stays cool in summer, while residents run errands on lunch breaks, a sign that the town serves locals, not just tourists. Downtown lights flicker on at dusk, proof that the old core still moves with life. Those scenes add up to a legacy that resists either simple condemnation or uncritical praise. Everyone who studies him eventually returns to the same question. Can a life that begins in criminal enterprise earn respect through decades of lawful work and public service? He left no speech with an answer. He left a city that offers balancer beams for anyone weighing the matter. He left buildings, programs, payrolls, and a civic fabric strong enough to absorb shocks. He left memories of envelopes slid across desks in earlier decades, and memories of checks written to buy a neonatal incubator in later ones. He left process-tight books, clear roles, early calls to regulators that made chaos rare. He left friends who missed him and critics who kept writing, both of whom had material to support their views. At night, the strip glows in layers that reflect everyone who has touched it. His layer includes a quiet man in a suit answering questions without drama, a developer leafing through a pro forma with a pencil tucked behind his ear, a philanthropist sitting with a hospital board, and, yes, a younger figure loading cases into a truck on a cold riverfront years earlier. He never denied any of those images. He held them together as his truth. The city he helped shape keeps them together as its own, still growing, still attracting ambition, still demanding organization to keep the promise shining without burning out. That was always the work. That was always his answer. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Morris Dalitz here, thanking you for joining me on this journey through vision, ambition, and the building of an empire from nothing but opportunity. If this story helped you unwind tonight, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Your support truly helps us keep bringing these powerful stories to life. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories reach. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.